It had 3 engines and a glass cockpit and a range that could carry passengers halfway around the world without stopping. By every specification that appeared in its sales literature, the McDonnell Douglas MD-11 was a technological achievement, modern, capable, advanced beyond what the DC-10 it was designed to replace had ever been. And yet, the pilots who flew it, experienced professionals, men and women with thousands of hours on wide-body jets, people who had mastered aircraft that most of us will never see the inside of, describe it with a word that you don't often hear applied to commercial aircraft by the people whose job is to control them. They call it honest, and they mean it as a warning. Honest, in this context, doesn't mean trustworthy. It means the MD-11 showed you exactly what it was going to do, and what it was going to do in certain conditions at certain speeds in the final critical seconds of a landing was something that the most experienced hands in the industry found genuinely, specifically, professionally unsettling. This is a story of an aircraft that was advanced enough to humble the people trained to master it. To understand why the MD-11 developed the reputation it did among the pilots who flew it, you have to understand the circumstances under which it was created, and why those circumstances produced an aircraft that was, in certain specific and consequential ways, optimized in directions that created problems the optimizations themselves couldn't solve. McDonnell Douglas in the late 1980s was a company under pressure that was becoming difficult to distinguish from desperation. The DC-10's accidents, the Paris cargo door disaster of 1974, and the Chicago engine separation catastrophe of 1979 had damaged the company's commercial reputation in ways that sustained good operational performance had only partially repaired. The passenger market had moved toward twin-engine widebodies, Boeing 767 and the Airbus A300 family, with an enthusiasm driven partly by the economics of twin-engine operation and partly by the reputational gravity that the DC-10 disasters had given the tri-jet configuration. McDonnell Douglas needed a response, not just a new product, but a statement, an aircraft that demonstrated the company was still capable of building something at the frontier of what commercial aviation required. The MD-11 was that statement. Derived from the DC-10 airframe but modernized in almost every system, it was positioned as the next generation of long-range wide-body travel, the aircraft that would re-establish McDonnell Douglas in a market that Boeing and Airbus were dividing between them. The changes from the DC-10 were substantial. The fuselage was stretched, the wing was fitted with winglets, the small upturned tips that reduce drag by managing the vortices that form at the wingtip, improving fuel efficiency in a way that the airlines evaluating the aircraft found commercially compelling. The cockpit was completely redesigned around the two-crew glass cockpit, eliminating the flight engineer position that the DC-10 had required and replacing the analog instruments of the older aircraft with digital displays that reflected where aviation technology had moved in the decades since the DC-10 entered service. The fuel efficiency improvements were central to the MD-11's commercial proposition, and McDonnell Douglas pursued them with an aggressiveness that would prove consequential. Every pound of fuel saved per flight hour translated directly to operating economics, and in the competitive environment McDonnell Douglas was navigating, the operating economics had to be convincing enough to overcome the company's reputational disadvantage and the Boeing and Airbus alternatives that airlines were also evaluating. One of the ways the engineers pursued fuel efficiency was by reducing the size of the horizontal tail, the horizontal stabilizer at the rear of the aircraft that provides pitch stability and control. A smaller tail created less drag. Less drag meant better fuel economy. The aerodynamic calculations supported the design. The certification process validated the design. What the calculations and the certification process could not fully capture was how the reduced tail authority would feel to a pilot in the specific, demanding, compressed timeline environment of a landing, particularly a landing that had developed any of the small imperfections that real-world operations regularly produce. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The MD-11 was different from the DC-10 in ways that were immediately visible and in ways that only revealed themselves in the specific conditions that distinguish a routine landing from one that requires everything a pilot has. The glass cockpit was the most immediately apparent change and the one that received the most attention in the aircraft's marketing. 2 pilots instead of 3. Digital displays instead of analog gauges, a flight management system that could plan and execute the most efficient routing across any oceanic crossing, calculating fuel consumption and winds and step climbs with a precision that the DC-10 systems couldn't approach. Pilots transitioning to the MD-11 from older wide-bodies described the cockpit as impressive in the way that genuinely sophisticated technology impresses: comprehensive, logical, capable of things that the previous generation of systems simply couldn't do. The winglets were visible from the boarding gate and became, for many passengers, the visual signature of the aircraft. They did what they were designed to do: improved fuel efficiency by managing the aerodynamic inefficiency at the wingtip, and the operational fuel burn numbers reflected their contribution. The MD-11 was more efficient than the DC-10 it replaced, and in the markets where range and fuel economy drove fleet decisions, that efficiency was commercially meaningful. But the characteristic that the MD-11's pilots describe with the most consistency, the most precision, and the most evident unease is the one that came from the horizontal tail reduction. The MD-11 was less stable in pitch than the DC-10 had been. Not dramatically, not in a way that produced obvious instability during normal flight operations, where the flight management systems and autopilot managed the aircraft's pitch attitude with a smoothness that pilots found completely acceptable. But in the manual flying environment of a landing approach, particularly one that had become slightly unstabilized, a little fast, a little high, a little displaced from the ideal glide path, the reduced pitch stability created a handling characteristic that was different in kind from what experienced wide-body pilots had been trained on and had built their instincts around. The MD-11 was described by pilots as PIO-prone, susceptible to pilot-induced oscillation. What this means in plain terms is that in certain conditions, the aircraft's response to control inputs could arrive slightly out of phase with the pilot's expectation, leading to a sequence where the correction for an initial deviation produced an overcorrection, which required another correction, which produced another overcorrection, the oscillations building rather than damping. On a large, fast, heavy aircraft in the final seconds of landing, a PIO sequence was not an academic problem. It was a situation that compressed from manageable to critical faster than training and instinct could reliably address. The MD-11's landing behavior was not consistently dangerous. The vast majority of MD-11 landings, the thousands of routine arrivals that accumulated across the aircraft's operational career, were performed without incident by crews who had learned the aircraft's specific requirements and managed them with professional competence. But the aircraft had a narrower margin for the small imperfections that real-world landing conditions regularly produce: crosswinds, gusts, weight variations at the heavy end of the landing envelope. Any of these could push an approach toward conditions where the MD-11's reduced pitch authority and PIO tendency became factors that demanded something beyond routine technique. And in the accidents that accumulated in the MD-11's early years, those factors were present. The human experience of flying the MD-11 as a professional pilot has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the testimony about other demanding aircraft, because the demand the MD-11 made was concentrated in a single phase of flight, a single moment, in a way that created a sustained professional vigilance that pilots describe as unlike anything else in their careers. Cruise was not the problem. The MD-11 at altitude, managed by its flight management systems, was a sophisticated and capable aircraft that pilots found genuinely impressive to operate. The glass cockpit was clear and logical. The systems were comprehensive. The aircraft's range allowed routing that the DC-10 couldn't achieve, and the efficiency improvements translated to economics that airlines valued and that gave the aircraft a commercial rationale that its crews understood and respected. The problem was the landing. More precisely, the problem was the landing in conditions that were anything other than straightforward. And in the global airline operation that the MD-11 was designed to serve, straightforward conditions were not guaranteed. Pilots who flew the MD-11 in its early years describe a specific adaptation process that was required before they felt genuinely competent on the aircraft in all conditions. Not just type-rated, not just checked out. Genuinely competent, the kind of competence that lives in the hands rather than the head, that allows a pilot to manage the specific demands of an aircraft in the compressed, dynamic environment of a challenging landing without thinking consciously about the technique. That competence on the MD-11 took longer to develop than on comparable aircraft. The aircraft's specific landing characteristics required a recalibration of technique and instinct that training programs could initiate, but that only operational experience could complete. One veteran FedEx MD-11 captain who flew the type for over a decade in cargo service describes the learning curve with a directness that is characteristic of pilots talking honestly about an aircraft when there's nothing left to prove. The MD-11, he says, let you know very clearly when your technique wasn't right. Other aircraft would absorb small errors. The MD-11 would show them to you, in the landing roll, in the approach corrections, in the specific way the aircraft responded to inputs that would have been adequate on something else. It wasn't punishing, he says, it was exact. And being exact with a large aircraft at high landing weights in gusty conditions required being exact in a way that some landings simply didn't allow. The accidents that occurred in the MD-11's early service, Alitalia at Milan in 1995, Federal Express at Subic Bay in 1997, and most publicly China Airlines at Hong Kong in 1999, were investigated with the thoroughness that aviation accident investigation brings to bear on events that have killed people. The Subic Bay accident killed all 3 crew members of a freighter. The Hong Kong accident killed 3 and injured many more on a passenger flight. The investigations identified the MD-11's landing characteristics as a contributing factor in each case, not the sole cause, but present in each event in ways that a more pitch-stable aircraft might not have produced. McDonnell Douglas and later Boeing issued advisories. Training programs were revised. Operators with significant MD-11 fleets invested in simulator training specifically targeting the landing phase and the conditions under which the aircraft's behavior was most demanding. The techniques improved, the accident rate improved. But the professional conversation about what the MD-11 asked of its pilots and whether what it asked was within what could be consistently delivered in real-world conditions never fully resolved. The MD-11's commercial conflict ran alongside its operational one, and the two stories intertwined in ways that neither could escape. The fuel efficiency shortfall was the first commercial wound. McDonnell Douglas had promised airlines operating economics based on performance projections that the aircraft in initial service did not fully meet. The gap between projected and actual fuel burn was not enormous, but in an industry where operating economics are calculated on margins that leave little room for pleasant surprises, a shortfall in fuel efficiency was a problem that required active management and damaged the trust between manufacturer and customer that commercial aviation depends on. The Boeing 777 entered service in 1995 and immediately redefined what airlines expected from a long-range wide-body aircraft. Twin-engine, modern, extraordinary range, economics that the tri-jet MD-11 couldn't match across the route structures where the two aircraft competed. Airlines that had been evaluating MD-11s ordered 777s instead. The market that McDonnell Douglas had needed the MD-11 to win was moving toward Boeing with a momentum that no revision to the MD-11's economics could reverse. The merger of McDonnell Douglas with Boeing in 1997 ended the MD-11 passenger program. Boeing had no commercial interest in developing or marketing an aircraft that competed with its own 777, and the MD-11's passenger variant production ceased. The aircraft found its most durable home in freight operations, where FedEx and UPS and other cargo carriers valued its range and payload, and where the landing weight conditions that had produced the most demanding handling characteristics were less routinely encountered in passenger operations. In freight service, flown by crews trained specifically for the MD-11's requirements, the aircraft's accident rate improved significantly. The aircraft found the operational context in which its specific capabilities and its specific demands could be matched. High-weight, long-haul cargo operations, managed by specialists who knew the aircraft thoroughly and had developed the specific expertise that thoroughness of knowledge produced. The MD-11's legacy is the legacy of a lesson about where the boundary between aircraft capability and human limitation actually lies, and what happens when design decisions push an aircraft closer to that boundary than operational experience can consistently manage. The investigations and the regulatory responses that the MD-11's early accidents produce contributed to the broader aviation safety framework in ways that go beyond the aircraft itself. The discussion of PIO susceptibility, of the conditions under which aircraft characteristics and pilot inputs can combine to produce oscillations that exceed the pilot's ability to damp, became more rigorous and more operational as a result of the MD-11 experience. Certification standards for pitch stability were reviewed. Training requirements for demanding landing characteristics were formalized in ways that the MD-11's operational history made specific and urgent. In freight operations, the MD-11 continues to demonstrate daily that the aircraft's fundamental capabilities are genuine and substantial. The range, the payload, the economics at the operating weights where cargo carriers use it. FedEx has operated MD-11s for decades, with a safety record that reflects what specialized training and operational awareness can achieve on an aircraft with demanding characteristics, and what the aircraft offers in return for that investment. The professional conversation about the MD-11 persists in aviation circles because it raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. How much should an aircraft's handling characteristics demand of its pilots? What is the appropriate margin between what an aircraft will do and what a pilot can reliably manage? How do we calibrate the relationship between automation that can manage what humans cannot and the human oversight that aviation still requires? The MD-11 didn't answer those questions. It made them impossible to ignore. We began with a question. Why do pilots fear the MD-11? The honest answer is that not all of them do. The pilots who know the MD-11 best, who have flown it for years, who have accumulated the specific operational experience that transformed trained knowledge into embodied mastery, who have learned to read the aircraft's specific feedback and respond with the technique it requires, those pilots describe the MD-11 with professional respect rather than fear. They know what it asks, they have learned to provide it, and in the operational context of high-weight, long-haul freight where the aircraft now lives, that knowledge and that provision are sufficient. What pilots fear, more precisely, is the MD-11 in conditions where the margin for error is narrow, and the aircraft's specific characteristics demand more than the situation allows. The crosswind landing at heavy weight in gusty conditions, the approach that has developed a small instability and requires correction in a compressed timeline, the moments where the MD-11's reduced pitch authority and PIO tendency combine with real-world imperfections in ways that experience alone cannot fully insulate against. Those moments are rare. The MD-11's overall operational record reflects that rarity. But they exist, and the pilots who know them know they exist. And the knowledge that an aircraft has moments where it can exceed what you can reliably provide is a knowledge that shapes how you approach every flight, with an additional level of attention, an additional layer of vigilance, an additional awareness that the aircraft you are flying requires more of you than other aircraft have. That is not fear exactly. It is respect with an edge. The MD-11 earned that edge, and the pilots who flew it understood, from the first demanding landing to the last, exactly what they were managing. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.